Welcome to this series about the soul.
Have you started?
Okay, so last night we watched a programme on Channel 4 about Stonehenge, and it was quite interesting how they gathered these stones from faraway places, and it was as much about the physical labour and the ritual of bringing those stones to the space. And so I was thinking how linked to the soul is that kind of work or that kind of ritual process. So firstly, can I ask you, what is the soul?
Not an easy question, because for plenty of people the soul doesn't even exist, so you can't ask the question, what is the soul? Because the question presupposes that it exists. And one of the reasons it's hard to ascertain is that it's not an empirical object. It's not something you can measure. It's not something you can shine a light on or a telescope at or detect in somebody's body, or you can't pass some sort of thermal imaging camera over them and produce an image of the soul. So it's a moot point whether the soul exists or not. So for the purposes of this discussion, let's say by means of hypothesis that there's a soul, rather than by means of assertion or proof that there's a soul. So if there's a soul, and let's hypothetically say that there is a soul, what would it be? How would you begin to define it? And of course, there are lots and lots of different attempts that have been made to define the soul. One of the most famous is the definition from Aristotle, which we can go into, but actually an easier way into it is to think about how his work on the soul was translated into Latin, because his work on the soul was translated into Latin as de anima. So the word anima is the Latin word for the soul, right? Which to me is helpful because it relates to the word animal, obviously, in English, but also animate. And you can think of the soul, one can think of the soul as what animates the human being. To make that particularly vivid, a dead body is not animated. A live body, like yours or mine, for now at least, is animated. And you could argue, in this Aristotelian Latin tradition, that the thing which animates us is the soul. So it's that which animates. And so when somebody dies, apart from the expiration of all their physical faculties, something else goes too. They lose the soul, that which animates. Right? So you can think of it as the motor or engine or animator of the human body.
And so when we see some cultures in history, like when we went to the Ashmolean and we saw that the skull had been decorated with shells in its eyes, this could be a way of animating the dead, giving them a soul back?
It could be a way of animating the soul, except the body remains inert. It's now decorated. But I think what you're suggesting there comes on to the second meaning of the soul, which I think is slightly more abstract. So I think you could more or less, even if you're of a particularly scientific empiricist disposition, you might accept the notion that there is something that animates the human body when it's alive and doesn't animate it when it's dead. And you could maybe concede the fact that that thing which animates it is the soul, right? That's still arguable, but you could perhaps tolerate that kind of claim. What you're talking about there is a dead body. This was an artifact in a museum in Oxford, which had been then converted into a aesthetic and perhaps cultural artifact. A mask was made of the head, and to that mask were affixed shells for the eyes, sort of set horizontally, as if there were two eyelids. I think that connects with the notion of the soul as meaning. So when we talk about the soul more casually, perhaps, in our culture, or Western culture, maybe a bit more broadly, we think of the soul as something which is perhaps more attuned to meaning in life. And you mentioned Stonehenge at the beginning. Why do people go to Stonehenge? Well, whatever meaning they're seeking or wanting to have confirmed by visiting Stonehenge, it seems to be some sort of quest for meaning in some way, that there is meaning that can be derived from it. So whatever is involved with the soul would seem to be occurring at a level of deeper meaning than everyday life. So, everyday life might involve going to work, looking after children, socializing, and so on. And all of those will have kind of local individual meanings in the moment, and work can be meaningful, but the soul level of meaning seems to be something deeper. So I'd say that's the second way in which we understand the soul. And if you ask somebody, are you pursuing your soul's purpose, that's a pretty deep question. And it seems to be suggesting that the soul is a kind of barometer or index of meaningfulness in our lives. Now that meaning might vary from person to person, and one person might get meaning from turning up to Stonehenge at the winter or summer solstice and exacting from that experience meaning of their own. And I would say that is one way in which we understand the soul. The soul is that part of us, that invisible part, that abstract part of us, the non-physical part of us, which is most capable of deriving meaning at the deepest level. So I'd say that would be a second definition of what the soul is. It's the deep meaning part of us.
Do you think that the soul, this deep meaning, do you think it can leave an imprint on Earth? Or I'm thinking, Stonehenge, these people did such an amazing feat. Do you think that their soul, the people who built Stonehenge, their soul is imprinted so much that this is why people keep returning to this place?
Possibly. And again, we're in the realm of speculation here, because we can't say for sure one way or the other. We just don't know. And I suppose it's worth making the point in brackets that whenever we're talking about the soul, we're talking about a belief system rather than the scientific system. So, if you believe...
What would Richard Dawkins say about the soul?
I don't know, and I can't speak for him, but from what I know about him, I would imagine he'd reject even the hypothesis that there is a soul. I would imagine he'd say, if you can produce evidence for the soul, then I'm ready to believe it. But so long as there's no evidence for the soul, just as there's no evidence for God, I'm not prepared to believe it.
Well, isn't there a piece of evidence that you can weigh the soul? I can't remember where it's from, but I remember hearing that you could weigh it.
I've not heard that. There is a theory among many, many theories. And the point of the soul is there are so many theories that abound about it because there's nothing to limit those theories in science. There's no empirical data that can correct it. So you can say anything about the soul because it's a matter of belief. I could say the soul is pink and fluffy. I could say it's enormous and made of foam. I could say it's made of 3 parts and we have 2 of them and the third one belongs to our next door neighbour, because there's no scientific stricture that can correct that, because there's nothing to work from and counter. There's no theory that can be, it's not capable of being disproved, and therefore in scientific language doesn't even merit the status of a theory.
So I'm thinking leylines. If the Earth had a soul, would their leylines be a kind of, I don't know, energy coming from that soul? Hence why Stonehenge is on the leylines, and Avery and lots of other stone circles. And is this something maybe we've lost because we just don't feel it as much anymore?
There is a well-established idea that the Earth has a soul. And there's a phrase in Latin, the anima mundi, the soul of the world, which is, again, part of a belief system written about by lots of different people, including W.B. Yeats, for example. And it spills over into Gaia theory, and kind of more familiar notions that there's a Mother Earth, that the Earth isn't simply the physical substrate that we stand on and sleep on and lie on and are buried in and so on, but that it actually has an independent character of its own, which we can call the soul. Again, that's just a matter of belief. Would that manifest as ley lines? Well, again, I mean, you could say, yes, it does, if you're minded to believe that it does. But there's no, there's no scientific evidence, one way or the other. I just wanted to come back to what you said about Stonehenge, and would the soul of the people who built it kind of reside in that monument in some way. Again, if you believe that that's the case, there's nothing to kind of deprive you of that belief in a way. But I wanted to just say something else, in the kind of literature, or the religious or quasi-religious literature on the soul, that says actually a soul then migrates from one individual to another. So say those workers who built Stonehenge each had a soul. Rather than that soul then being transferred to the monument after they died, the more familiar notion would be that soul would then pass on to another human being.
Reincarnation.
Through reincarnation, or at least the transmigration of souls, the movement of one soul to another. Well, I say human being, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a human being, in a process, well, the fancy word for it is metempsychosis, that there's a transmigration of the soul from one body to another. And brackets within the brackets, although we think of the soul as that which departs the body at death, we can invert that thought and say, well, the soul is also something which requires a body as its vehicle. So although they may be separable at the point of death, that separation of the soul lasts only, for the twinkling of an eye before it actually goes to inhabit another body. So the soul is completely independent of personality in that sense.
So, the soul wouldn't go into structures like Stonehenge.
Well, it depends on your belief. If you believe it does, then fine. There's no evidence for it. But just because there's no evidence, there's no evidence for God, it doesn't stop people believing in God, does it? Because belief and science, or faith and reason, and I'm thinking here of the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, are just two different systems. No amount of reason can get you to a belief in God. At a certain point, you have to take what he calls the leap of faith. So belief just is a different system. And if you mentioned Richard Dawkins, for him there's no leaping to be done, because he needs evidence to get him to belief. And in fact, you could argue that for the purely puristic scientific mind, there are no beliefs, there's only knowledge. Anything that's worth knowing is not something that I would defer to belief on. Either I know it or I don't know it, and I'm not going to believe in anything whatsoever. That mindset says I have knowledge or I have nothing. Whereas I would imagine lots of people think, well, I have knowledge and I have some beliefs too.
And also, evidence kind of varies from person to person. Seeing how many crowds go to Stonehenge, maybe that's my evidence for it being a sacred place. But so it varies, doesn't it?
Well, I would make a distinction between evidence and experience. You might have an experience, as many of people do, of something miraculous, or that gives them cause to believe in the soul, and that experience can't in a way be taken away from them. I can't argue you out of an experience really, unless I begin to gaslight you in some way. But that's not evidence, because evidence needs more than one person, and probably several people, to be able to testify it, and it needs to be susceptible to proof and the repeating of the experiment and so on and so forth. But you raise an interesting question, because thousands of people go to Stonehenge. Does that therefore constitute evidence? Because you've got more than one person who's saying, or implicitly saying, look, there is a soul, or at least there's meaning in the visit to Stonehenge, and there's meaning associated with the solstice, and I'm deriving some sense of meaning and maybe some profound emotion as a result of that. But I think what you'd have to say is that subjective experience on the part of one person who has meaning from visiting Stonehenge doesn't aggregate up. So you could have 30,000 people going to Stonehenge, you could have 30 million people going to Stonehenge, all expressing some sense of profound meaning, and still it wouldn't satisfy that scientific criterion that there is a soul, because it can't be pointed at, it can't be measured. You've just got testimony. Now to me that's interesting, I think, because it sort of says, there's a possibility that if you get enough subjective testimony, then something is true. If enough people agree that you're actually made of plastic and bright blue, and you're a Lego person, and we get enough people to say, yeah, you are, then we're starting to creep from the subjective collective into something that's beginning to sound a bit more objective, because if enough people agree on it, then it becomes true. And we know that, unfortunately, from the era of fake news and post-truth, that's sort of what's going on at the moment. If enough people believe something, then it becomes true.
And I mean, Stonehenge, do I feel it's a sacred place because so many people have told me it's a sacred place?
Yeah.
I mean, when I go to Glastonbury, I always climb Glastonbury Tor because it's what I'm told I must do. So I guess you can find meaning if you feel like other people. I mean, what's the word for it? It's like a
kind of peer influence.
Yeah.
But you've introduced another angle there, because we are saying there it's not just that 30,000 people might all believe that Stonehenge is a soulful place, but that those people either directly or indirectly influence one another, and so one becomes susceptible to the beliefs of other people. If enough people believe something, then it becomes true, as with the Earth being at the centre of the cosmos. So that is a form of subjectivity, kind of multiplied by peer influence. And I mean, this is a tangent really, but I think probably we are susceptible to peer influence because we want to belong so much. We would rather put our belonging first and so believe what our peers believe, because not going along with what they believe risks our own being excluded.
Yeah.
So I think people tend to kind of hunt in packs on that, and the people who go along to, if I went along to Stonehenge as a pure rationalist who didn't believe it, I might feel a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, I might on the other hand feel I'm just looking at how stupid everybody else is, but at the same time I might feel a little bit anxious that I'm in a group that I don't belong to, and that group might to some degree wish to exclude me. I mean, maybe that's a poor example, because most people, I'm sure, go to Stonehenge quite friendly. But if I were to go to a far right rally, obviously I'm not, not obviously, but I'm not part of a far-right movement, I might feel some legitimate anxiety because I don't believe, I don't resonate with the beliefs of that particular group and might feel under threat.
The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives.
Very poetic, yeah.
Okay, shall we leave it there?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.